If you want to be a writer, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie and I review our first season of Story Nerd. When we were planning the podcast, Valerie and I decided to present seasons and to use each season to focus on a particular aspect of story theory. Season 1 has been about genre because we believe that everything about a story comes from its genre. Some of the questions we asked ourselves during the season were, what about genre blending? Why aren't marketing genres and writing genres the same? Are there any genre innovations in this particular movie that we're watching? And did this movie meet our expectations? Why or why not? So we'll discuss some of the stories we've analysed in this season, so there will be spoilers. So, Valerie, what is genre?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. We have an interesting problem in this industry. We're writers, so words are our stock in trade, yet we don't have a standard lexicon. So discussing our craft can get and does get very confusing. That means that there isn't a standard definition of genre, and that causes all kinds of problems. Let me explain. Readers define genre based on the categories in the bookstore or, whether it's an online store or bricks or mortar. Agents and publishers also define the genre based on the market and how they can best pitch a story to their reader. But authors, for us, we have to define a genre based on what it is we're trying to write. And we've got to be crystal clear about what kind of story we're trying to write. Otherwise, our manuscripts will go way off track. And to add a layer of complication, authors don't agree on what the word genre means. So not only does genre mean something different to readers, agents, publishers, and authors, within the group of authors, we can't agree on what it means. Some people think that genre means lowbrow fiction or commercial fiction. And by that, I mean a book that earns a profit. That sounds really sarcastic. It's not meant to be. They consider genre fiction to be poorly written stories and the opposite of literary fiction, which has prettier sentences, frankly. Some people think that genre fiction is a reference to a plot-driven book, and other people think that literary fiction refers to character-driven stories. So this word genre is just loaded. For me and for Melanie, when we use the word genre, we simply mean what kind of book it is we're talking about. What category does it fall into? So a reader, agent, and publisher might look at a book about a woman discovering her self-worth, and they consider it to be women's fiction or perhaps book club fiction. But as the writer, we look at that same book and we see a story that is possibly a status story or a worldview story. So all this to say that the very first thing we have to understand about genre is that there isn't one standard definition of what it means. Therefore, when you talk to other writers or you're trying to learn the craft in a course or from a book, my best advice is to focus on the concept that is being discussed, not on the label that is put on that concept. Melanie, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a pretty good summary. And it's probably one of the things that we've also struggled with during the season. So I think you've wrapped that up really nicely.
Groovy. Okay. The next thing, Melanie, Are you ready for this one? Of all of the books that we reviewed this semester, or not semester, this season, it feels like a semester in school. What is the most useful resource that you have found to help you understand genre?
Right. So when I look back over my notes and the scripts that we wrote for this season, there are a few things about genre that stand out for me. And I love the point that you made in episode 1, and I quote, is that in this industry, there is no standard definition of genre, which is what you just talked about. And yet both of us agree that everything in a story, if you want to meet a reader's expectation, stems from understanding genre. So as writers, we are searching for something that provides us with boundaries and provides us with those readers' expectations. And Janet Burraway, in writing fiction, said, readers of genre fiction have very specific expectation when it comes to plot, characters, setting, and theme. And each genre has its own conventions and rules. And that's on page 147. So that was something that I found very useful. And I think there's a general agreement in the industry that genre does give you expectations and that you need to conform to those things. It's just everything around that genre expectation, I think, that's fluffy and doesn't have great definition. So the other book that I really enjoyed using this season was John Truby's The Anatomy of Story. And in it, he had the idea of a premise and a designing principle. And I used that in our episode in Turning Red. And while not exactly the same as genre, these concepts, I think, provide constraints for writers and also help us think about what to include and exclude as we plan and then write our stories. So I think there are two approaches for writers to take. And I think one is to understand the story you're writing before you start. And the second is to write and then work out the genre after you've written a first draft. But it's the next step, I think, where plotters and pantsers start to take the same approach. And that's, when we're revising and rewriting as we go into our second or third drafts. And by the time you've got your first draft down, you should start to understand the conventions and rules of the story you're telling. And I think listening to podcasts like ours will help writers understand the principles and also point writers towards resources so that they can further their understanding. What do you think? How would you answer that question, Valerie?
Well, for my part, I think it's important to understand that genre, even when it means the kind of story we're talking about, doesn't refer to only one aspect of the story. This is a huge idea as far as I'm concerned, and one that really clears the mists of this whole genre discussion. So Robert McKee and Basim El-Wakil see genre as something that has different parts to it. In other words, we're not just talking about the kind of plot a story has. Now, plot is part of the story genre, absolutely, but it's by no means a complete understanding of the genre. It's not only a plot. In my notes from McKee's Genre Week seminars that I took in 2018, I think it was, in my notes I've written, quote, genre provides a map of the story territory. And I think that's a really useful definition that clearly Robert McKee said. I wrote it down. It defines the sandbox that we as writers are playing in when we're writing a story. Now, in the story grid methodology, Sean Coyne has borrowed this concept. He sees genre as having 5 areas to it, and McKee uses 6. They use different terms. Here we go with that lexicon issue again, right? But essentially, they're talking about the same things. So, when we consider genre, in other words, what kind of story we're going to write, we need to consider the following: which medium we're writing for, whether it's page, stage, or screen, and how we will present the story. Is it going to be prose, a musical, epistolary, a comedy, a drama, and so on? How long the story will be. So is it a short story, a novella, a novel, or a series? What kind of structure the plot will have, an arc plot, multi-plot, mini-plot, or anti-plot? what kind of world the story will be set in. Are you setting it in a realistic contemporary setting? Is it historical? Is this a fantasy world? Is it a futuristic sci-fi world? Is it dystopian? And so on. And we also need to consider what the content of the story will be. In other words, what the story will be about. Are you going to have a plot-driven story, like a crime story or a love story or an action story, that kind of thing? Or are you going to write a character-driven story? For example, worldview or coming of age. Will the story be concerned with the moral choice that a character must make, or how a character sees herself or is seen by others? This approach to genre, as it being an umbrella term that considers the type of story from these 5 or 6 different vantage points, is incredibly useful. It is super practical, and it really does help demystify so much about the story that you're telling. Now, I consulted a lot of reference books and resources this season, and courses, and just a lot. However, I didn't mention most of them on the show because I didn't find them very helpful. And I'm not going to pass along a resource that's not helpful. But trust me when I say that, with the exception of Robert McKee and Sean Coyne, and of course, Sean is borrowing from Robert McKee here, all of the sources touched on only 1 or 2 of those areas that I talked about a minute ago. And they weren't able to discuss how their different categories related to one another. So they either didn't understand, or they did understand and didn't bother to communicate the fact that how long a story will be is different from the type of world that the story is set in, which I found very interesting. And for the most part, they didn't seem to have an understanding that genre is more than the plot. So they might list, for example, 8 genre types, and 6 of them would be related to a plot, and the other 2 might be comedy and tragedy. I saw that a lot, comedy and tragedy. Well, comedy and tragedy aren't plot types, they're styles of delivery. For example, A Christmas Carol can be delivered in a very dark and horrifying way, and that's, the Alistair Sim version, if we're going to look at films here and think of the way films have represented them. And that's the way most versions of the story appear, because that's kind of what Dickens is doing, in my opinion. But it can also be delivered as a comedy. Look no further than The Muppets Christmas Carol. And if you haven't seen it, add it to your list. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I can recite the whole thing. So can both of my children. Now, the one thing that I would add to this is consider whether you want your story to end positively or negatively. Both type of endings will work, but negative endings or down endings are, 1, harder to pull off, 2, harder to sell, and 3, harder to get readers to recommend, because most people want to finish a story, even if it's a dark story, on a high note. Melanie.
Right. Well, they're really good points, and I like what you said there about, and we touched on it in that first question about not really having a definition. Although a lot of references that I looked at too couldn't give me a full picture. It's like they knew that genre had to include a whole range of things, and they made that point, but then they couldn't articulate that any further. And I do think that the 2 references that you mentioned, so McKee's story and the story grid, are the only resources that I've come across so far as well that do give us some sort of framework to analyse genre and understand that as writers, so that we can start to look at our own stories in the context of the genre. So I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. So the other thing I think we wanted to, that, in our discussions off the, as we're preparing for the recording, is what aha moments that we had. And so I had a couple of really interesting aha moments this season. And the biggest one for me, I think, came from The Courier. And that was when I realised that just because there's a spy in a story doesn't make it a spy story. And watching The Courier also gave me a chance to test some of the conventions that I've observed and drafted against this particular movie, and sort of refine what type of story a spy story is in my own mind. And I think the ideas and conventions that I had actually held up when I compared it to the Courier. It made me super excited to finish my work in progress and get started on the spy story that I have waiting as a first draft off to the side, that I've been waiting to work on for quite some time. So having watched the Courier and coming up with some of those theories was a real aha moment for me. And I hope it also helped those audience members or listeners who are interested in spy stories refine that even further. Watching Knives Out also inspired some of the concepts for me of having the two plots going on in your head, the one that you're writing and the one that the master detective is working on in the background. And I really love that movie for the way that it bent and tested some of the conventions of the murder mystery genre. That was really fascinating, and I think it gave me a chance as well to bed down and discuss this genre in greater detail than some of the other stories that we watched. And, we both really like murder mystery stories, so it was really easy to burrow down into that particular story that we looked at this season. So these two movies stood out to me as well as stories with the cleanest genres. They told one story and they told it very well, whereas some of the other stories didn't have easily identifiable genres, and as a result, they were more difficult to analyse. And perhaps I should include West Side Story with The Courier and Knives Out, but it didn't stand out to me as a great story compared to some of the others, well, compared to those two particular stories either. The most I learnt from West Side Story was from what you said, Valerie, and the comments you made about tired stereotypes and what stories do to our psyche. And there I'm referring to the wonderful quote that you used from Wired for Story by Lisa Cron. The most challenging stories for me were the 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri, and Being the Ricardos, simply because their form, which tended to be more anti-plot and mini-plot, were not as familiar to me as arch plot stories are. So I learned a great deal, even though I really struggled with analysing those two particular movies. However, the story I think that will stay with me the longest was The Power of the Dog, and because that was just, the storytelling was sublime. Jane Campion didn't take the easy route with her characters and the story, and in hindsight, I can also see how Peter's words about what makes a man and his ability to move obstacles are words that we can apply to all of our stories. So stories are about how the protagonist reacts when obstacles present themselves. So this movie for me has really, I suppose, haunted my thoughts in a good way, and my thinking about story in a really good way. And I have to say, it was much easier to analyse stories that I'm familiar with and stories that I read or watch a great deal of. So, Valerie, what did you take away, or what were your aha moments for this season?
Well, first of all, I'm going to put you on the spot. So this book you're writing, when are you going to have done?
Well.
Do you want to go on the record with the deadline?
By Christmas time. By Christmas time, I will have my current work in progress done.
Christmas time of which year?
This year. You are pinning me down. Yeah, this year, the Christmas time this year. So I am trying with all the other things that I need to do to really try and bed this story down. And I do love this story, and it's been with me for a while, but I do need to get it finished so that I can move on and look and write new things as well. So there you have it. It's on the record.
Awesome.
Now, don't you ask me in January if I finished it or not. No, you should ask me that, actually. You should make me answer that question in public.
All right. That's what I'm going to do. The first episode that we record in January, I'm going to say, so how did it go? All right. Aha moments for season 1. Well, let me tell you, it didn't take long for them to rack up. I mean, holy Hannah. The first aha I had, I suppose, was around the plot type. And you alluded to this already, Melanie. It started right in episode 3 with 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri, which is the hardest movie I have ever analyzed in my whole life. And in the past, I have absolutely fallen into the trap of thinking about genre in terms of plot. Even though I know the difference, I still do it. And that film was a great wake-up call for me. Yes, arc plot stories are most prevalent, but I have to remember not to automatically make the assumption that when I'm analyzing a film or novel, that it's going to be arc plot. And when I keep my mind open, that means I'm going to be able to learn more from those particular authors and works of art. Being the Ricardos gave me a little more practice in seeing how non-arc plot stories work. But I know I'm going to need to do a lot more study here of multi-plot and mini-plot stories. And at some point, I will do a deep dive into them and pull them apart and really see how they work. The other aha came around blending genres. And again, I'm talking about Power of the Dog, just like you did, because it is a masterful piece of writing. I am still thinking about that movie, to be honest. There are so many storytelling lessons to learn there. But in the interest of time, I'll just highlight one. Anyone who believes that they're blending genres must watch this movie. It is, without question, the best example of blending genres that I have ever come across. It is advanced storytelling, like super advanced storytelling. It's not for the faint of heart, let me put it that way. And that brings me to the last aha moment that I'll mention here right now, and that's about innovating genres. So as writers, what we want to do is present our stories in new and fresh ways. One of the ways that we try to do that is by blending genres, right? And to do that, we first need to know which genres we're blending and how they work in their, quote unquote, pure forms. It can be done, and The Power of the Dog is an excellent example, but that's not the only way to innovate a story. The more we study stories, and I don't mean passively watching a film or passively reading a novel, I mean actively studying the story, actively considering the genre, the theme, the way the characters are presented, whether they're archetypes or stereotypes and that sort of thing. The more we do that, the more insights we'll have about how we can innovate stories. Let me give you one example. Melanie and I both watched Top Gun Maverick in the last week or two, and we both agreed that the story's pretty thin, but it did give the audience what they wanted, which is a chance to revisit those characters in that world while enjoying some fabulous new aerials. Now, I'm about to give spoilers about Top Gun Maverick, but let's be honest here, there's not much to spoil. It's a Tom Cruise movie, and we all pretty much know how those things work. So while I was in the theater, yes, absolutely, I had fun. It was a hoot and a half, and so did my daughter. She came to the movie with me. It's not hard to get swept up in the visuals and the sound. Now, I'm not much of a Tom Cruise fan, perhaps you can tell. He really grates on my nerves. But I do have to give credit where credit is due. The man knows how to make a film that is in his brand. He really does. And I just saw a note today, is it Mission Impossible 7? They're getting Lord. Anyway, but while I was in the theater, I had fun. That said, 10 minutes after the movie was over and I left the theater, both my daughter and I started to have questions. I'm not kidding. I am not exaggerating. Before we even got out of the building, we were wondering, well, a lot of things. For example, we wondered why Jennifer Connelly's character was nothing more than a love interest for Tom Cruise. We wondered why Kelly McGillis wasn't in the movie. We wondered why Meg Ryan wasn't there. They did use footage of her from the original movie, but they didn't have her back. We wondered why there was only one token female pilot and why none of the superior officers were women when they could have been. Yes, admittedly, we were both very relieved that the character Phoenix, the pilot, didn't end up being a love interest for Rooster. We were both expecting it, either Rooster or the new Iceman. I can't remember his character. So that is something. At least Phoenix wasn't the love interest. She was a pilot. So we did a little research, and it turns out that they didn't ask Kelly McGillis to be part of the movie because she looks her age, heaven forbid. She's 4 years older than Tom Cruise. That's all, just 4 years. She does look amazing. Google it. A modern picture. She's got lovely, she looks lovely. Her character in the film is also older than Tom Cruise's character, right, in the first film. So if she looked older than he looks now, well, that would make sense. Now, I am not in any way trying to criticize Jennifer Connelly. Not at all. She's an actor who auditioned for the job, and the role is the love interest. So, yeah, she has to pay her bills too. No problem. She's 9 years younger than Tom Cruise, but looks 15 years younger. Okay, so what about Meg Ryan? Well, the easy answer here is that they killed off her character, so therefore she wouldn't be in the film. But why did they kill off her character? Again, the research that I did reveals that the producers, what they wanted to do with Maverick was give this new film a fresh look. They didn't want to always be looking backwards. They wanted to have some new characters introduced. And yeah, that's fine. That's fair enough. I can go with that. But if that's true, why did they use the old footage of her? That didn't make any sense. It's more likely, in my opinion, that she wasn't included in the movie because she too looks her age. She's the same age as Tom Cruise. So I'm trying not to rant, but I can feel it coming on. Here we are again, right? Think back to episode 2, I think it was, when we did West Side Story. Once again, we have a major Hollywood player, a white guy, perpetuating these stereotypical female characters. And this has got to stop. It's got to stop. Now, lest you think I'm just being cranky, I recommend you watch a TEDx talk called The Women in Film Revolution Begins With You. And then begin to observe how women are portrayed in these major Hollywood films. Once you start seeing the stereotypes, you will never watch movies the same way again. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. For example, and this is just one thing that you can keep an eye out for. Typically, women in movies are there to ask the questions so that men can provide the answers and look heroic. Start counting up how many times you hear a woman turn to the man and say, "What do we do now?" Just do that one thing. Make it like a drinking game or something if you want to. Now, I'm just talking about how women are portrayed, but you can do the same thing by observing how people of color are portrayed in movies. So why am I harping on this? Why am I talking about it again? It's because Lisa Cron's words ring very loudly in my ears. Quote, "We're wired to turn to story to teach us the way of the world." What we see in movies is what we think of as normal. People choose entire careers because of the way things have been portrayed in film. I just saw an interview with Allison Janney, who said that because of her character as CJ Craig on The West Wing, women have told her they get more involved in public service, in politics, and all that kind of stuff. This is a big deal, what we're doing. So if you want to innovate your story, regardless of its genre, looking at the way women are represented or people of color are represented is really fertile ground. We're just waiting for stories to be innovated along these lines. All right, rant over for now. So, okay, let's see if we can wrap this up a little bit here, Melanie. What's the bottom line here for you? The big key takeaway about genre that you can pass on to all of us?
So I think understanding the conventions of a genre before you write that type of story is one of the most important things that has come out for me in this season. I think we need to read, listen, and learn so that we understand what the conventions are and then meet readers' expectations. And as Valerie said, a story is about one thing, because if it's about everything, then it's about nothing. And genre helps you present the one thing your story is about.
For me, the bottom line here, the big takeaway from this whole 10-episode season is that genre is not only about the plot. Really look at those 5 or 6 areas that Robert McKee, Basim El-Wakil, and Sean Coyne talk about. It will make your creative life so much easier.
So that leads nicely into just some recommendations about what references we found the most helpful in this season, and also which ones we'd recommend to you as our listeners to understand genre. So like Valerie, I reviewed a number of my familiar references throughout this season, and I also discovered some new ones. But to understand more about genre, I think Story by Robert McKee and The Story Grid, What Good Editors Know by Sean Coyne are really the go-to references. I'd also recommend John Truby's An Anatomy of Story because it provides writers with practical steps to work out what your story is about. Other good references would be Building Imaginary Worlds, The Theory and History of Subcreation by Mark J.P. Wolfe for those who are writing science fiction and fantasy stories. And also Alexandra Sokolov's Screenwriting Tricks for Authors. This book breaks down the types of stories and also provides great advice on how to analyse movies and develop your own ideas for writing a script. So Valerie, what do you think? What are your recommended references?
Well, I second your recommendation for Robert McKee's Story and The Story Grid, What Good Editors Know. But I also think that every writer should read Wired for Story by Lisa Cron. Okay, so that is season 1 in a nutshell. In season 2, we're going to look at 2 different storytelling principles. Melanie, why don't you start? What are you going to look at in season 2?
All right, so I'm going to be looking at the forces of antagonism. So I am interested in the sources of conflict in stories because, as mentioned during our June episode, without conflict, stories are just recounts. So I want to see how the forces of antagonism push the protagonist into action and create the obstacles that get in the way of what the protagonist wants. Because without the forces of antagonism, I don't think we have a story. And so I'm really excited and I can't wait to delve into this aspect of storytelling. So Valerie, what are you going to do?
I'm going to do a deep dive into The Hero's Gift Expressed. Now, what says you is that? Well, I'll tell you all about it next week. But basically, this is one of those storytelling tricks that very few people talk about or really understand. At least I haven't come across it in very many reference books or craft books. But honestly, it's the key to making the ending of your story work. So definitely tune in next week and I'll give you a whole lot more information about it.
Right, so that wraps it up for this week and for season 1. So join us again next week when we kick off season 2 with an analysis of Legally Blonde. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/innercircle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find more out about me, please visit melaniehill.com.au or find me on Facebook as Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take one step at a time and have fun.